Each account has its own history. Each was created in circumstances that dictated what it said and how it was recorded, and thus how it was transmitted to us. Each has omissions and gaps, and each one adds detail and richness. For example, in his earliest account in 1832, Joseph gave us a highly personalized account of his experience in the grove.
Using the language of the revivals, he said he became convicted of my sins, but he could find no place for forgiveness, since there was no society or denomination that built upon the gospel of Jesus Christ, as recorded in the New Testament, and I felt to mourn for my own sins, Joseph wrote. This account describes how the Lord appeared and filled Joseph with the Spirit of God, and spake unto me, saying, Joseph, my son, thy sins are forgiven thee. It emphasizes the atonement of Christ and the personal redemption it offered Joseph. He wrote in his own hand that as a result of the vision, my soul was filled with love, and for many days I could rejoice with great joy, and the Lord was with me.
That early account of Joseph Smith's first vision is one of the most beautiful documents in the whole corpus of his works. The great issue is, am I worthy? Can I be forgiven of my sins? It's a personal quest. And the first words that Jesus says to Joseph in the 1832 account are, my son, thy sins are forgiven thee. I think nowadays that's a message we need to bring back so that our children, our young people growing up, realizing that if they sin, they can be forgiven just as Joseph Smith was forgiven.
Joseph and his counselor scribe, Frederick Williams, recorded this document in 1832, a full decade before Joseph published any of his other accounts. Church historians brought this one across the plains with them to Utah, but it became largely unknown to Latter-day Saints until Paul Cheesman published it in his master's thesis in 1965.
I'll never forget when I put my head into that microfilm machine up in the church historical department, started it going, and saw Joseph Smith's handwriting. And as I read through that first account of the first vision, there was a feeling that came over me that I don't think I had ever experienced before, and not quite anything like I've experienced since, that said to me, this young man is telling the truth. It's a powerful story. It was a story, it was a handwritten story that didn't have very good grammar, had no punctuation. It was just one long, maybe two sentences in the whole thing. But the power that was in it, representing the feelings of a young man who is trying to put across how he felt before he went into the grove to pray, was just absolutely powerful to me. And so that was one of the things that confirmed the testimony I already had, but confirmed in an even stronger way the reality and the integrity and the honesty of the story of the first vision. But the reason I liked that first account so very much, that I saw as I stuck my head in the microfilm machine, and like it so much better in some ways than many of the other accounts, is that here's an account that is what you might call the unedited Joseph Smith, the unhelped Joseph Smith. Nobody helped him write it. This is his own handwriting. This is Joseph Smith, pure and simple, giving his deep feelings as best he could remember them and writing them out by himself.
I like also what he wrote in the 32 account about what happened after. He said he felt a peace that was really not describable. I just think of the experience of this young boy, 14 years of age, who went into the grove, saw the Father and saw the Son, learned his sins were forgiven, learned about the atonement of the Savior. No wonder after he felt a peace that was really indescribable, that continued for days.
Actually, one of the reasons that I like the 1832 account is because it has so many new insights. We learn not just that Joseph Smith was concerned when he was 14 years old, but he says he had these concerns from the time that he was 12. He was going to revivals, he was listening to what other people had to say, and he was concerned about the things that he was hearing. We learned that he was concerned about things other than just which church is right. That's pretty clear in all of the accounts, but in that early account, he also says that he was concerned about the welfare of mankind. If people were teaching things that were not right, that did not seem to comport with what was in the Scriptures, which he says, he was concerned about the welfare of mankind. He was concerned about the welfare of his own soul. He says, am I going to be forgiven of my sins? In fact, he uses a very interesting phrase. He uses the phrase, I was convicted of my sins. And that's quite similar to what other people who were telling about their revival experiences were saying. They get to a point where they realize that unless they do some repenting, or unless they have some kind of epiphany, some kind of relationship with God, that they would be, as they put it, convicted of their sins. And so he was concerned for his own soul. And then, of course, he was concerned about which church was right. But his concern for his soul, his concern for forgiveness of sins, his concern for the welfare of mankind, all represent the depth of this young Joseph Smith.
3 years later, in 1835, an eccentric visitor from the East inquired of Joseph, whose scribe captured some of Joseph's response in his journal. In this account, Joseph cast the vision as the first in a series of events that led to the translation of the Book of Mormon. He emphasized the opposition he felt in the grove, how he made a fruitless attempt to pray but couldn't speak until he knelt and was enabled. This account tells that one divine personage appeared in a pillar of fire, followed shortly by another. I saw many angels in this vision, Joseph added as an afterthought, noting, I was about 14 years old when I received this first communication.
It was an important account for the reason that it was a little different from the one that we had, and it related things that we didn't know about. In the 1835 account, for example, he says he saw many angels in this vision, something that didn't exist in the others.
A week later, Joseph told another inquirer of the vision, though his scribe recorded only that Joseph gave the fellow an account of his first visitation of angels rather than describing the vision itself. The two accounts Joseph's scribe Warren Parrish penned into his journal in November 1835 were later copied into a draft of Joseph's history, but they were generally unknown to Latter-day Saints until LDS historians published them in the late 1960s.
I was going through some of the early documents and came across this account of the first vision that hadn't been published before. It was the 1835 account. When Willard Richards, who was writing the history or compiling the history of Joseph Smith, the 1838 history later on, came to that part, rather than including the account of the vision, he just referred to it as recorded in the early part of this history. So he just left out the account, and I don't know what the reason was. It was an important account for the reason that it was a little different from the one that we had, and it related things that we didn't know about.
Joseph published two accounts of the vision during his lifetime. The first of these to be written, and the best known, is in Joseph's manuscript history, written in 1838 or 1839, before being published in the church's newspaper in 1842, and now excerpted in the Pearl of Great Price. Of the two accounts published in 1842, the one in the Pearl of Great Price was first to be written, but the first one published was Joseph's response to Chicago Democrat editor John Wentworth's request for a sketch of the rise, progress, persecution, and faith of the Latter-day Saints, as source material for a friend, George Barstow, who was writing a history of New Hampshire. Many of Wentworth's papers were destroyed in the 1871 Chicago fire, and there is no evidence that Barstow used Joseph's account. But Joseph had it printed in March 1842 in the church's Times and Seasons newspaper, making it the first account published in the United States.
I retired to the place. He says, I was enwrapped in a heavenly vision and saw two glorious personages who exactly resembled each other in features and likeness.
Besides the 5 accounts that come from Joseph or his scribe directly, there are also a handful of contemporary hearsay accounts, meaning that they were written by people who heard Joseph describe his vision. Orson Pratt wrote one of these and published it in Scotland in 1840 as an interesting account of several remarkable visions. It echoes passages from Joseph's earlier accounts and prefigures passages in later ones.
The thing I like about the Orson Pratt account, he says, Orson said it himself, he says, I have often heard Joseph relate this, and so when you read the account, even though it's something that was published in Europe, and you might say, well, Joseph wasn't there. He had heard him tell it apparently enough times that I think he got it. He added some things that are very important in my estimation. One of them is his description of the light. He says that I saw a very bright light and glorious light in the heavens above, which at first seemed to be at a considerable distance. He continued praying while the light appeared to be gradually descending towards him. And as it drew nearer, it increased in brightness and magnitude, so that by the time that it reached the tops of the trees, the whole wilderness for some distance around was illuminated in the most glorious and brilliant manner. We expected to have seen the leaves and the boughs of the trees consumed as soon as the light came in contact with them, but perceiving that it did not produce that effect, he was encouraged with the hopes of being able to endure its presence. It continued descending slowly until it rested upon the earth, and he was enveloped in the midst of it. When it first came upon him, it produced a peculiar sensation throughout his whole system, and immediately his mind was caught away from the natural objects with which he was surrounded, and he was enwrapped in a heavenly vision and saw two glorious personages who exactly resembled each other in their features and likeness. That description of the light doesn't appear in any of the others, and I think it's a marvelous statement, and it's very graphic. You know, you get the feeling that something really impressive happened there, and that light, the appearance of it is marvelous.
Pratt's account of the vision is the most thorough of the third-person accounts. Other hearsay accounts include Orson Hyde's 1842 German publication of an account very much like Orson Pratt's, the first translated publication of a first vision account. Levi Richards wrote in his journal of hearing Joseph relate the vision in June 1843. David Nye White, editor of the Pittsburgh Weekly Gazette, wrote in his newspaper of his August 1843 interview with Joseph, including an account of the vision.
He adds this one little bit that doesn't exist in any of the other accounts, which he says, I immediately went out into the woods where my father had a clearing and went to the stump where I had stuck my axe when I had quit work and kneeled down and prayed.